Despite the fact that Nvidia is launching both an 8GB and 16GB version of the 5060 Ti, it seems like they're trying to hide the 8GB one from reviews. I can only assume to mislead customers into accidentally buying the bad one. I don't know, guys. I was sent a 16GB 5060 Ti to review. This one's the PNY model. And in this video, I'll be placing it up against the 4060 Ti in both its 8 and 16GB versions so we can get a rough idea of what happens in some games when you're at 8GB of VRAM instead of 16. Like, for example, here at 1080p Supreme in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, the game just crashes and cannot even begin on an 8GB card. But what if you're playing at, reduced settings? You still see issues at medium settings at 1080p resolution in some modern games on an 8GB graphics card. We see that here with Indiana Jones and the Great Circle turned down to 1080p medium. You can see on the frame time graph that we're getting blips at regular intervals as the game has to pull memory from system RAM through the PCIe bus instead of accessing it quickly from VRAM, causing performance issues. This is why the 4060 Ti 16GB card is noticeably faster than the 8GB card, despite the fact that they will run at exactly the same performance when there's not a spillover past 8GB of VRAM, and this is especially pronounced in the 1% lows, where the 8GB card is especially struggling. We would expect the 5060 Ti 8GB card to also be suffering from these problems, which is probably why Nvidia isn't wanting these cards to be out there for the reviews. To provide some evidence for this, here's a couple of things. Number one, this was my email reply from Nvidia when I asked about getting an 8GB sample. They said there will not be an 8GB sample. And I was curious whether this just applied to me, so I reached out to see if there was some other information on that. This is taken from a videocards.com article saying that, interestingly, reviewers have told them, so reviewers plural, so not just me, and I did not tell them anything, by the way, have told them that Nvidia is not actively participating in supplying 5060 Ti 8GB models for reviews, and in fact, some reviewers have mentioned that Nvidia specifically instructed board partners not to ship such graphics cards for testing. Now, I don't really have context at the board partners to get that type of information, but apparently these are the claims being made. So my main thought here on the 5060 Ti is the 16GB version is going to be the better choice than the 8GB version. I would love to tell you by exactly how much by testing the 8GB version, but that'll have to wait until these are actually on sale and I can buy one and then produce some content later. But I'm hoping that people don't go ahead and buy the 8GB version one thinking it's the 16GB version one. And yes, the average consumer can be tricked by that kind of thing, especially if these are stuffed into pre-builts and things like that. Now, I'm going to run a bunch of tests here at both 1080p and 1440p. And again, to examine the 8GB issue, I'm not just going to test at maximum settings. We will test max or near max settings in games, but I will also test out medium or some otherwise reduced settings depending on the naming scheme in the game to show these issues. And again, both at 1080p and 1440p. And I will also be showing the side-by-side footage so you can look at things like the frame time graph issues and also spot whether or not you see any like missing textures and things like that, because that's another issue that can be caused by VRAM. More of that, but first, these are the Viture Pro XR glasses, which offer the equivalent of a 135-inch, 120Hz full HD display wherever you go. I was actually blown away by the clarity and brightness of the display, and the electrochromic lenses automatically dim for full immersion even in bright environments. The Viture Pros have a ton of use cases, but one of my favorites is gaming on my Steam Deck. The XR glasses have a higher resolution and frame rate than the built-in Steam Deck display, and also allow me to sit more comfortably. There's no need to worry about holding up the Steam Deck awkwardly if I'm laying in bed or trying to tilt my head down to look at the device. I can even easily stream using Moonlight from my RTX 5090 gaming PC and play games at a maxed out 120Hz while lying in bed comfortably. It's awesome. I wish I had time to say more, but the overall experience shows Viture's attention to every detail of their product and ecosystem. From the magnetic release USB-C connector to the adjustable dials for nearsightedness correction on the virtual display, they offer a polished experience that screams quality. Follow the link in the pinned comment or video description for a great deal on these amazing XR glasses, and a huge thank you to Viture for sponsoring the video. Okay, so we've already looked at the results for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 1080p medium and at supreme settings. To summarize, we saw that at 1080p Supreme settings, 8GB cards can't run the game, but the 4060 Ti 16GB is cruising right along at 87 FPS, 77 FPS 1% lows, flat frame time graph, things look good. And the 16GB 5060 Ti is also doing just fine, in this case with 99 FPS average, 89 FPS 1% lows, a nice flat frame time graph, and overall it's a 14% advantage in the averages for the 5060 Ti versus the 4060 Ti that has the equivalent VRAM amount. I imagine the 8GB cards would be tied at exactly 0 FPS because they're dead. At 1080p medium, again, the 4060 Ti 8GB card is showing issues, indicating that the 5060 Ti 8GB would also be showing issues, but I can't test that without a sample. That'll have to come in a future video. The 16GB 4060 Ti is doing just fine at 106 FPS. The 5060 Ti 16GB is 17% faster. But what if we go ahead and move to 1440p resolution at medium settings? So at medium settings 1440p, the 4060 Ti 16GB is hitting 77 FPS, and the 5060 Ti 16GB is hitting 93, putting it 21% faster, although the 8GB card was doing worse and had worse 1% lows. If we go to 1440p Supreme settings, which again are the max graphics preset that isn't path tracing, so without path tracing turned on, although this game always does use some amount of ray tracing, here we once again see that the 8GB card cannot even load the game at these settings. However, the 16GB 4060 Ti hits 66 FPS average, and the 5060 Ti hits 77 FPS average, putting it 17% ahead at the averages and also in the 1% lows. Smooth frame time graphs. This is a very well optimized game if you have enough VRAM for the settings that you're using. I'm going to go ahead and get my fat head out of the way for these tests. Now we're looking at Final Fantasy 16. Again, for those of you saying that 8GB is fine at 1080p, at least not at ultra settings in Final Fantasy 16, where we see the massive spikes on the frame time graph for the 8GB card and awful 1% lows. Meanwhile, the 4060 Ti 16GB is hitting 59 FPS average, and the 5060 Ti 16 is hitting 73, putting it 24% faster than the 4060 Ti with the same amount of VRAM. If we drop down to medium settings, though, this is yet another game where even at 1080p resolution and even at medium graphics settings, the 8GB card is showing huge problems. There's massive noticeable stutters, which you can see in the frame time graph, and bad 1% lows as a result. Whereas the 16GB cards are hitting 76 FPS and 97 FPS respectively, and the 5060 Ti is actually 28% ahead of the 4060 Ti in that test. Moving up to 1440p resolution, unsurprisingly, at ultra settings, 1440p, the 8GB card is choking, especially noticeable spikes in the frame time graphs. That manifests as stuttering in gameplay, and bad 1% lows in the numerical results. Whereas the 16GB card is hitting 41 FPS, which isn't great, but the 5060 Ti is hitting 50 FPS, putting it 22% ahead of the 16GB previous generation card. Dropping down to medium settings at 1440p, we see that the 8GB card is still having problems, still noticeable stutters and frame time spikes, whereas the 16GB cards are not having those same issues. The 4060 Ti 16GB is hitting 52 FPS, whereas the 5060 Ti 16GB is at 65 FPS, putting it 25% ahead of its last generation counterpart, and is the only card here able to average over 60 FPS. Now, you can, of course, use DLSS. So using DLSS quality and at medium settings, we can see that the 4060 Ti 16GB can now hit 76 FPS, whereas the 5060 Ti 16GB hits 99, actually putting it 30% faster now here. Whereas the 8GB card is still having massive stutters, so even though its average breaks 60 FPS now, its 1% lows are at 21, there's huge noticeable stutters and massive spikes on the frame time graph. Let's move to Horizon Forbidden West. At 1080p, we are once again seeing problems on the 8GB card, with worse 1% lows and averages compared to the 16GB version. Again, we would expect the same issue on the 5060 Ti 8GB, but we don't have that model to actually test for launch day reviews. The 16GB 4060 Ti is averaging 79 FPS, and the 5060 Ti is averaging 89, putting it 13% faster in this test. Sorry, slight edit in the footage here. I noticed that I had typed the incorrect numbers. Actually, I left up the numbers from the last slide for the 1% lows at 1080p medium here. Apologies. Correct 1% low values are up here, here, and here. Anyway, at 1080p medium settings, things are looking okay on the 8GB card now. All the cards are averaging high FPS numbers over 100. And we see the 4060 Ti at 110 FPS average. The 5060 Ti is 12% faster at 123 FPS. At 1440p very high settings, I can once again move my head out of the way of those errors. And we can see that the 8GB card is once again having lower averages and 1% lows compared to this 16GB card, indicating that would probably happen with the 5060 Ti as well. And when comparing 16GB models, the 5060 Ti has a 12% lead in this game at 64 FPS average versus 57. Now, again, we can turn down graphics settings. One way to turn down graphics settings, though, is to use upscaling. So here we're looking at staying at the very high settings, but using DLSS quality, because I think that's the way a lot of people will use these cards. We see the 4060 Ti 16GB at 76 FPS, and the 5060 Ti is 17% faster at 89 FPS. Whereas the 8GB card is not able to boost its performance as much as the other ones when using DLSS, because it is having to slow down and wait for information to come across the PCIe lane from the system memory. So there's, again, so in other words, DLSS didn't save the day on the 8GB card. We could drop down to medium settings, though, and by dropping down to medium settings, we are now seeing the averages tied for the 8 and 16GB cards at 73 FPS, whereas the 5060 Ti is 19% faster at 87 FPS. The 1% lows are a small difference for the 8GB card, but it's not a lot. 2 FPS, 4% difference. Could just be run-to-run variance, or maybe something else is going on there. We could also try using DLSS on the medium settings. So again, if you're after high refresh rate experiences, you can get there at the right settings combos. So medium settings, DLSS quality at 1440p, pushes the 8GB 4060 Ti up to 103 FPS, putting it within margin of error of the 16GB card at 106. The 5060 Ti 16GB is 10% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB at 117 FPS. But let's check out some of the big NVIDIA feature sets like path tracing. So what about path tracing? Well, Cyberpunk is a big path tracing showcase with its RT overdrive mode. If you're trying to do native res path tracing, though, these cards cannot even handle 1080p resolution. At 1080p RT overdrive, only the 5060 Ti breaks a 30 FPS average, and its 1% lows are only at 25, so it's not a good experience. However, if you look at the frame time graph, the 8GB card is doing by far the worst here, indicating that 8GB of VRAM is definitely a problem at these settings. But even if you have enough VRAM, these settings are just too demanding for these GPUs. The 5060 Ti is 11% faster than the 4060 Ti 16GB, though, at 31 FPS versus 28. But again, all the DLSS and all of that can be factored in here. Cyberpunk features the newer DLSS 4 transformer model, and at this point I am not enabling frame generation, to be clear. This is the transformer model upscaling at quality settings. And here this does get the 5060 Ti up to 56 FPS average, so actually somewhat usable here at these settings. And quality level upscaling at 1080p, I used to shy away from it, but with the new DLSS 4 transformer model, this is pretty usable. The 4060 Ti 16GB is at 50 FPS, so the 5060 Ti is 12% faster, and the 8GB version is still showing massive spikes and stutters in the frame time graph, and is also manifesting as lower averages and 1% lows. But note that those big spikes are going to be manifest as stutters that are more noticeable than you're seeing in just the percentage differentials. So do keep that in mind. Now, what about frame generation? So let's take a look at that. So the 5060 Ti, one of its big differentiating factors is that it offers multi-frame gen, which goes up to a ×4 mode. It also supports the older ×2 mode, and it supports a ×3 mode. The 40 series cards only support the ×2 mode. So it matched like-for-like ×2 mode settings with DLSS 4 quality as a baseline and then using frame generation ×2 mode to interpolate a frame between each rendered frame. We see that the 5060 Ti is 11% faster at 101 FPS versus 91. However, note that the responsiveness of this will not feel like 100 FPS. It will feel more like 45 to 50 because the generated frames don't increase responsiveness. You can see this in my latency metric. If you use the ×4 mode, obviously you get double the frame rate of the ×2 mode. Now, if we move up to 1440p resolution at RT Overdrive DLSS 4 transformer model using balanced upscaling, being more aggressive here since we're at a 1440p output, these cards are really getting questionable here on whether these are usable settings. So I really don't think these are great path tracing GPUs, even the 5060 Ti at a 1440p monitor. Again, I'm going down to balanced level upscaling. You could go down to performance mode. That starts to get pretty difficult even for the new transformer model for a 1440p output. Anyway, the 5060 Ti is 13% faster than the 4060 Ti with the same VRAM capacity by 13% at 44 FPS versus 39. However, notice that we're not at great frame rates from which to use frame generation. Notice our latency numbers here are already kind of in the mid 40s to 50 millisecond range of latency. And then we'll go ahead and kick on frame generation. Notice that that makes that even though the frame rate number is increasing, the latency numbers are increasing a little bit as well, and they are not improving. So while in the ×2 frame gen mode, all the cards break 60 FPS, and the 5060 Ti is at 75 versus 67 on the 4060 Ti with the same VRAM, which is a 12% advantage, I don't personally feel like achieving 75 FPS through frame generation is an amazing gaming experience due to both the latency and the image quality that you can get in those generated frames. If you go into the ×4 mode, you can get a really big frame rate number to show up. You get 133 FPS on the 5060 Ti, and those are being presented to your display, but they are not, this doesn't feel like 133 FPS of responsiveness that you're used to, and also there can be some issues in the artifacting of those generated frames. Now, I'm not saying frame gen is useless. I'm just saying I think that the base frame rate there was a bit lower than I would like from which to use it. Notice, for example, that if we just turn off all the ray tracing and everything at 1440p ultra settings, now the 5060 Ti is hitting 80 FPS, and it's in the low 20 millisecond of latency, right? That's a huge difference compared to that 133 FPS through ×4 frame gen that was around 60 milliseconds of latency. See, there's a very big difference in responsiveness between achieving a high frame rate with frame generation and without needing frame generation. Anyway, here at 1440p Ultra, the 5060 Ti is also having the biggest lead we've seen so far at 80 FPS versus 58 compared to the 16GB models, putting it 38% ahead. Now, if we go ahead and use balanced level upscaling on the ultra settings, just to kind of show a use case that people might go for here, then the 4060 Ti's can hit 84 and 85 FPS respectively, and the 5060 Ti hits 109, putting it 28% ahead of the 4060 Ti with the same VRAM capacity. If we drop down to 1080p and just use ultra settings without any of the ray tracing stuff, all the cards are achieving good high frame rate numbers now. Notice that at 126 FPS achieved without frame generation, the latency numbers are in the teens and often well below 20 milliseconds of latency, which again, when you compare that to the 133 FPS achieved through ×4 frame generation, where we were up around 60 milliseconds of latency or more, this is a very different experience, right? This is the difference between actually achieving a high frame rate through rendering frames quicker, which also boosts responsiveness and has zero compromises to images, versus the high frame rates achieved through frame generation. Anyway, the 5060 Ti is 26% faster than the 4060 Ti with the same VRAM capacity here, because it's 126 versus 100. So that's an easy percentage calculation to make, isn't it? Anyway, let's look at God of War Ragnarok. At 1080p ultra settings, we see the 5060 Ti hit 84 FPS, so it does a good job maxing out this game at 1080p, and that puts it 20% ahead of the 4060 Ti's, which are hitting 70 FPS average. I'm seeing no sign of 8GB causing a problem in the minute-long test I did here. However, I have seen in my comment sections on my video talking about VRAM usage in this game, many users reporting that there are certain areas of this game that crash if they at higher settings because they do go beyond 8GB of VRAM. So that's one of the limitations of just doing a minute-long benchmark run, is that you can't always capture the VRAM-related issues. Now, at 1080p medium settings, frame rates go way up to 94, 95, and 110 respectively. So again, just kind of margin of error between the 8 and 16GB 4060 Ti's, and the 5060 Ti is 16% faster than the 4060 Ti with the same VRAM capacity. All of the cards giving you a nice high frame rate experience at these settings. At 1440p Ultra, the 5060 Ti is 18% faster than the 4060 Ti's at 66 versus 56 FPS. And again, not seeing any signs of VRAM-related issues here in this test area at this test length. But again, I have seen reports of 8GB cards having issues in certain areas and longer play. If we kick on DLSS quality on the 1440p Ultra settings, we now get probably more like the experience a lot of people would choose to do to get this extra performance, where the 5060 Ti is hitting 87 FPS versus 74 on the 4060 Ti's, putting 18% advantage for the 5060 Ti. Now, at 1440p medium settings, the 5060 Ti is able to hit 88 FPS, putting it 19% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB. The 8GB card is 1% ahead of the 16GB card here, again, just being margin of error between the two test runs, and again, in this particular area of the game, not seeing any VRAM-related issues. At 1440p medium with DLSS quality, now all the cards can offer a nice high refresh rate experience with 96 FPS on both of the 4060 Ti models and 115 FPS on the 5060 Ti, putting it 20% ahead. In Silent Hill 2, this is an Unreal Engine 5 test case. Max settings with hardware ray tracing turned on, but only at 1080p resolution. The 5060 Ti is 20% ahead at 60 FPS versus 50 on the 4060 Ti models. Turning down to medium settings, we get much better performance out of all the cards, with the 5060 Ti hitting 93 FPS average versus 74 on the 16GB 4060 Ti. So 27% average advantage for the 5060 Ti in this case. Again, no signs of 8GB causing an issue in this test area. Once again, I have seen comments on my VRAM-related video testing this game that there are other sections of the game that do show some issues on 8GB cards. Silent Hill 2 1440p Epic with ray tracing turned on does start to show VRAM-related issues, where the 8GB card is averaging and is much worse in the 1% lower versus the 16GB card. The 5060 Ti is 21% faster than the 4060 Ti with 16GB here at 41 versus 34, but generally I don't deem these as the frame rates that people would likely want to be playing this game at on PC, so I think that most users would go ahead and turn something down. One option to turn down is the internal rendering resolution, so kicking on DLSS quality gets us much better frame rates. The 5060 Ti is now averaging 65, putting it 25% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is hitting 52 FPS. The 8GB card is a bit slower than the 16GB card here, potentially indicating something VRAM related, although I'm not seeing VRAM usage reporting above 8GB. So it could be run-to-run variance, although that's a bit more than what we've seen in general case on this. Now at 1440p medium settings, we see both 4060 Ti models averaging 53 FPS, whereas the 5060 Ti is 23% faster at 65 FPS. If we kick on DLSS quality, all the cards do much better, but the 8GB card has the nicest result at 69, although that's 1 FPS less than the 70 FPS on the 16GB model, but again, that appears to just be margin of error between test runs. And the 5060 Ti is 29% faster than the 16GB 4060 Ti at 90 FPS versus 70. Let's go ahead and look at one more Unreal Engine 5 game with Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga. High settings are the highest settings available in this game. There's nothing above that, and there's no hardware ray tracing available. Here we see the 5060 Ti at 71 FPS, putting it 22% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is hitting 58. And the 8GB card is slightly below the other two cards here. Again, could be margin of error, run-to-run variance, or it could be VRAM related, although I'm not seeing VRAM usage indicating that. Again, this is a game where in certain parts, 8GB does become an issue at high settings, although this particular short test run that I'm doing here does not seem to be capturing that, at least in any major way. At 1080p medium settings, we are seeing the 5060 Ti boost all the way up to 92 FPS, putting it 18% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is at 78. The 8GB card, again, coming in a few percent below the 16GB card here, but I'm not seeing indications of using above 8GB of VRAM, so potentially run-to-run variance, or maybe there is something going on there that's just hard to indicate in the stats. At 1440p high settings, we see the 5060 Ti 16GB hitting 49 FPS, putting it 17% ahead of the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is at 42. And then 1 FPS drop on the 8GB model, again, likely just run-to-run variance, although the 1% lows are showing a bit wider of a gap. The overall frame rates here aren't really great, so kicking on DLSS quality would be a reasonable thing to do. This puts both 4060 Ti models up over 60 FPS at 62 and 64 respectively, and the 5060 Ti is going up to 78, putting it 22% ahead of the 16GB 4060 Ti. Now, at medium settings at 1440p, but no upscaling, we see that the 5060 Ti is good for 66 FPS, giving it an 18% advantage over the 4060 Ti 16GB, which is hitting 56 FPS. The 8GB card coming in, again, probably just margin of error below the 16GB card. Kicking on DLSS quality is boosting frame rates quite a bit here. So 1440p medium DLSS quality, the 5060 Ti can now hit 100 FPS, which puts it 20% ahead of the 83 FPS average for the 16GB 4060 Ti. And again, a small reduction of performance on the 8GB card. Again, they're not physically the same card, so maybe just slight boosting differences in this particular game or something, that kind of thing. Looking at Ghost of Tsushima, we now see the worst advantage for the 5060 Ti we've seen throughout the entire video, at only 7% advantage over the 4060 Ti's, which are both averaging 83. Also, I'm seeing some visual corruption right here. Do you see this? Let me actually go back a little bit. There is, as we come up these stairs, watch for the burning pile of stuff on the 5060 Ti. It's going to be flickering. So this is a case where I am seeing some visual corruption on just the 5060 Ti, but not on the other cards. You can see it a little bit in these lampposts, but as we get the larger pile of burning stuff, whoops, did not mean to slide that, meant to slide myself, right here. See this flickering kind of crazy? Anyway, so not only is the 5060 Ti performing badly here, but it's also showing some visual corruption issues. So this probably indicates some kind of driver-related problem for the 50 series card that is not showing up on the 40 series cards. This review timeline was rather compressed, so to be clear, the 4060 Ti's were tested a day ahead of me receiving my 5060 Ti sample because they gave almost no time to test these things. And the driver was released rather late. So I had to perform my testing on the cards other than the 5060 Ti prior to getting the 5060 Ti review driver, to be clear. We're seeing that flashing again right here, so it is consistently happening on the 5060 Ti. Anyway, the 5060 Ti here is now 10% faster at 128 FPS when we drop down to medium settings. But all the cards are getting a nice high refresh rate experience at those settings. At 1440p maximum settings, so very high settings are the name of that preset here, we see the 5060 Ti 11% ahead of the 4060 Ti at 63 versus 57. Again, 11% not a great advantage compared to what we've seen in a lot of these other ones, and we are once again seeing the flickering issues on the little graphical corruption thing we're seeing there. Ghost of Tsushima 1440p very high with DLSS quality enabled. Once again sees a 10% advantage for the 5060 Ti at 92 versus 84 on the matched VRAM capacity models. The 8GB card is not showing issues here. Again, just minor run-to-run variance. Now, at 1440p medium settings, we see the 5060 Ti take a 13% lead, but we are still seeing those flickering graphical corruption issues on the 5060 Ti. It's 86 FPS versus 76 FPS on the 4060 Ti 16GB. Again, 13% lead for the 5060 Ti here. If we kick on DLSS quality on the medium settings, we can get nice high refresh rate experiences on all of the cards, although once again seeing the visual corruption on the 5060 Ti. And it's a 14% lead for the 5060 Ti at 133 FPS versus 117. Now, if we go to Call of Duty Black Ops 6, I test this game at the basic preset because I think in most competitive games, people turn down graphic settings for a competitive edge in both frame rate and visibility, getting rid of clutter and things like that. This is the worst result we've seen in the whole video for the 5060 Ti at only a 5% lead over the 4060 Ti at 196 versus 186 FPS. And this is not a CPU limitation or anything like that, because I've seen on other cards, the averages can go up to 300 FPS on my 9800X 3D platform. So that is not a CPU limitation. That is just the 5060 Ti only producing 5% better frame rate. However, at 1440p, it does increase its lead to 9% at 140 FPS versus 129. So not a mind-blowing lead, but hey, at least it beat 5% this time. Now, all these cards are giving a nice high refresh rate experience, but you might still want a higher refresh rate experience by using DLSS. Remember, using DLSS, upscaling does increase responsiveness, unlike frame generation, so in a competitive title, it's a good choice. Frame generation is a poor choice for competitive titles because of the cost to latency. But again, upscaling is a good choice for competitive titles because it increases frame rate and responsiveness. Here we're seeing the 5060 Ti drop to only a 6% lead over the 4060 Ti at 183 FPS versus 172. And that is all the tests that I ran. So this chart summarizes the average percentage advantage for the 5060 Ti versus the 4060 Ti when both are at the 16GB models in every single game. So the numbers in this chart are not a frame rate number, it's a percentage advantage for the 5060 Ti. You can see that there is a wide range of values. My guess on that is it depends on which games are benefiting the most or the least from the GDDR7 memory, because that's the main spec increase here that really stands out to me. There are more cores, but not like a lot more cores. So I think that's kind of the main spec. That's my take on why we're seeing this performance differential in different games. The geo-mean, so the average result here, is 18% faster. So what do we make of this? What do we make of the 5060 Ti? An 18% generational performance increase is certainly nothing particularly exciting. I would be more excited with 40% generational improvements and kind of okay on like a 30%. 20% or less is kind of like, well, okay. But I think we do need to take into context what's actually going on in the real world and pricing and things like that for a more fair analysis of the situation. So one thing to note is the pricing that this is meant to be. So the 5060 Ti is supposed to have a $429 MSRP for the 16GB model. The 8GB model is supposed to come in at $379. That's a $50 price gap. With that price gap, it certainly feels like the 8GB model, in my opinion, should not exist. The 8GB model, while I was unable to test it in this video, we have indicated in this video that 8GB is a problem in multiple big name releases that I did not specifically choose to test VRAM. I just chose my normal set of games from recent releases in the last year or so, focusing mostly on AAA titles. And even reducing settings to medium and even at 1080p, we were seeing 8GB causing a problem in multiple games. So I think that at almost $400, this is a bad buy, and I worry that Nvidia is offering this as like if these get shoved into pre-builts, a lot of people who buy pre-builts are not going to be super aware of the difference between these two models or even the existence of two different models. And I think that this is going to be an unfortunate trap for a lot of people buying pre-built systems, or even the maybe less educated people buying the GPUs separately. Again, if you know what you're doing and you choose to buy the 8GB to save the money, that's up to you. Just make sure you're understanding the choice that you're making. As I showed in my testing, there are still multiple games that are fine on 8GB of VRAM. Especially older games are going to be fine on 8GB of VRAM, and especially esports games, and especially when turned down to low graphic settings, are going to be fine on 8GB of VRAM. That being said, the number of games that are not fine on 8GB of VRAM is growing every single year and will continue to grow. And if we continue to see these underwhelming, 18% performance uplifts generationally, then you might be buying a card that you're holding on to for many, many years. And if you're doing that, I really don't think 8GB is a good place to be. That's my opinion. If you still choose to buy one because you're like, I literally play one esports game all day, every day, that's it, and it doesn't need more than 8GB of VRAM, and that's all I'm gonna do for the next 5 years, okay, then make that choice, all right? But I'm just making sure you are fully informed on the differences here. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more again about how to interpret this card and its price. So the real world situation right now for graphics card pricing is absolutely awful. If you look at cards from AMD, like their 9070, these are meant to be $550. If I want to buy one in stock right now, I'd have to pay like $900. That doesn't mean they don't come in stock nearer to MSRP, but they're gone instantly when they do. Same thing for cards like the 5070. The availability for these have been a bit better, but this is meant to be a $550 card. And if I wanted to buy one in stock right now, I would have to pay $700. These have been flashing in stock at MSRP more than most of the other cards. However, they do sell out instantly. You have to be on a supply drop alert thing and just get right in there if you want any chance at an MSRP card, and that's at $550. So whether or not the 5060 Ti is actually widely available at $429 remains to be seen. If it is, then in the context of the current market, where there's really nothing else available at that price that's at least has any business being at that price, then it might be an okay buy in the current market. For example, previous generation cards like the 4060 Ti have kind of stopped production to make way for the 50 series card, meaning that the ones that are in stock new are at massively inflated prices. You might do better on the used market. Cards like the 7700 XT, which from AMD were recently available in this price range, also have their prices up here in $500, almost $600, because generally just supply on these has been cut back to make way for the new generation. So again, this is really, if it does enter at this price, it is entering a price point which currently has almost nothing available new. So in that context, the 16GB model here might be a decent buy. In an ideal world, I would be a little less excited about the 18% performance improvement compared to last generation. Now, I will say at least, though, that the 16GB model last generation was a $499 MSRP, although it didn't sell at that price and quickly reduced to about $450 on the actual market. So this is a bit of a price cut along with an 18% performance increase. So there is that. The other thing, as I mentioned during the side-by-sides, but in case you missed it, is the feature set difference for the 50 series. I tested it at some point here. Where was it? Frame generation. So the 40 series cards have ×2 frame generation. The 50 series cards can do ×3 and ×4. Now, none of that makes the game more responsive. We talked about that in the latency figures. So really, the reason to use these higher frame generation modes, I do think it's a good feature, and I want to be 100% clear on this. I think frame generation is a good feature, and multi-frame generation is also a good feature. What it's good for is taking an already good frame rate where the game feels responsive enough. You don't need it to feel more responsive because it's responsive enough. Everybody has a different baseline for that. And then using frame generation to increase the motion fluidity on a high refresh rate display. x2 frame gen mode already does a good job of that, because for a lot of people, a 60 FPS baseline before enabling frame gen will then still feel pretty good with frame gen activated, because 60 FPS already felt okay, but then you'll get the motion fluidity of over 100 FPS. x4 frame mode would be taking 60 FPS to more like 200 FPS. If you don't have a monitor that goes that high in its hertz, then it's pretty much useless. Because unlike running like an esports game at 1,000 real FPS, where even if your monitor can't keep up, the game is becoming more responsive, so can still provide a competitive edge, frame generation doesn't do that. So there's absolutely no reason to ever go above your monitor's refresh rate by using multi-frame generation. So that being said, multi-frame generation is only particularly useful if you have a 200 hertz plus monitor, at least in my opinion, because for me, the baseline for which it becomes a pretty usable feature is around 50 to 60 FPS. Other people could have different preferences on that, but all I can give you is my subjective opinion on that. x2 frame gen already does a pretty good job at taking 50 to 60 FPS to a pretty smooth visual motion fluidity that would be at home on a 120 hertz or 144 hertz display. So that's my true thoughts on frame generation. It's good at taking a good experience and making it more motion fluidity, and the x4 mode is good at doing that for higher refresh rate displays. It's cool, but again, it's not raw performance. Anyway, so there's all of that. That's my thoughts on the 5060 Ti. I highly recommend avoiding the 8GB model unless you really know what you're doing and are 100% confident that you are okay with those compromises to save the $50. Wouldn't be my personal opinion. Anyway, this $429 price point also has one last caveat if you're in the United States, which is that Nvidia was absolutely clear to media that this is a pre-tariff pricing. Meaning, if tariffs end up affecting graphics cards or their supply chain or anything like that, this price will go up. Now, in other countries, you might have VAT. Nvidia was also very clear that this price is pre-VAT, things like that. So we'll have to see where this actually falls price-wise in the market. And in a market where GPUs are all kind of overpriced and in poor supply, perhaps this would be a good thing if it does pop up near its MSRP, and at least it has the 16 gigabytes of VRAM and all of that. And you can see the overall performance in the games, maybe it's not an amazing path tracing GPU, but in all the other games, we were able to get pretty good settings and frame rates and all of that. So there you go. That's my thoughts on the 5060 Ti. Stay tuned for tons of follow-up content comparing against other graphics cards that are either at similar performance or pricing tiers, or like, hey, is it worth spending more money on the 5070? How does it stack up to a 4070? I'll do tons of comparisons. That's what my channel's all about, along with GPU news. So I hope you guys stay tuned if you're interested, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.